Hello, students. Today, I am going to talk about the poem A River, written by A.K. Ramanujan. Before we delve into the analysis, I would like to talk about certain aspects which is important in the analysis of any poem. Poetry as a work of art is rooted in a cultural milieu. Poetry as a work of art signifies the social fabric. So, when we analyze a poem, we get to see the socio-cultural issues. And when we analyze a poem, it is important that we place that poem in a historical framework, in a historical context that it represents. We will be able to conceive the socio-cultural issues or the political issues better by looking at the tradition of Indian English poetry. That is why it is significant that when we are going to analyze, interpret a poem, we place it in its cultural context to know more about social and cultural issues. Now, let me talk about something about the Indian English tradition of poets or poetry. Before independence, Indian English poets expressed their nationalistic sentiments and metaphysical consciousness. Poets like Henry Louis Vivant de Rosio, Sarojini Naidu, Rabindranath Tagore, they tried to instill nationalistic fervor, nationalistic sentiments, and their poetry expressed metaphysical sensibilities. Aurobindo Ghosh's verses also reflect sublime and spiritual states of minds. Now, these transcendental or metaphysical sentiments can also be seen in Toru Dutt's poetry and in certain poets before independence. You would often notice some westernized perspectives. Now, after independence, the new poets heralded a new tradition. Poets like A.K. Ramanujan, Nissim Ezekiel, Dilip Chitre, Tom Morris, Arun Kolatkar reveal a separation from the metaphysical tradition or metaphysical school of thought in the Indian English tradition of poetry. They, their poems did not talk about, you know, metaphysical consciousness or transcendental existences. They started talking about the social issues. Their poems started to talk about themes pertaining to identity, familial ties, alienation, social or personal alienation, memory, nostalgia, sense of loss, and also ecological concerns. Poems of A.K. Ramanujan, like Obituary and Extended Family, present the readers with relatable familial issues of the middle class society. Social and cultural alienation and quest for personal identity are some more themes which can be deciphered from A.K. Ramanujan's poetry. M.K. Nayak critically observed, I quote, in the poetic tradition, In the poetic technique of all his contemporaries, Ramanujan appears to have the surest touch, for he never lapses into romantic cliche. So you will get to see that A.K. Ramanujan's poem, A River, and also if you read his other poems, you will notice that he doesn't get lost in romantic cliches. He talks about social issues, realistic issues that people face. He questions society, he questions cultural norms that blind people from reasoning, from rationality. Ramanujan's another poem titled Ecology creates a semblance between memory and ecology, representing familial bonds and the bond between nature and humans. So, ecological concerns or eco-critical consciousness could be observed in most of his poems. Now, let us begin with the poem A River written by A.K. Ramanujan. I will share my screen and show you a PPT, and in that, I will start with Ramanujan's introduction. Then I will read out the poem and gradually move to the interpretation. Now, E.K. Ramanujan was awarded Padma Shri in 1976 and Sahitya Akademi Award posthumously in 1999. He wrote in Kannada and in English language. He had translated many old Tamil and old Kannada English, or old Kannada texts into English. He wrote many essays, many commentaries, and a plethora of poems. He had taught at University of Baroda, Chicago, Berkeley, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Harvard University. Now let's read the poem and then we will analyze. A river. In Madurai, city of temples and poets, who sang of cities and temples, every summer a river dries to a trickle in the sand, bearing the sand ribs, straw and women's hair, clogging the water gates at the rusty bars, under the bridges with patches of repair all over them. The wet stones glistening like sleepy crocodiles, the dry ones shaven water buffaloes lounging in the sun. The poets only sang of the floods. He was there for a day when they had the floods. People everywhere talked of the inches rising, of the precise number of cobbled steps run over by the water, rising on the bathing places, and the way it carried off 3 village houses, one pregnant woman, and a couple of cows named Gopi and Brinda as usual. The new poets still quoted the old poets, but no one spoke in verse of the pregnant woman drowned, with perhaps twins in her, kicking at blank walls even before birth. He said, the river has water enough to be poetic, about only once a year, and then it carries away In the first half are three village houses, a couple of cows named Gopi and Brinda, and one pregnant woman expecting identical twins with no moles on their bodies, with different colored diapers to tell them apart. Now, let's start with the analysis. First of all, students, let me tell you that the poet makes an allusion. He alludes to the Vaigai River of Tamil Nadu that crosses through Madurai. Now, in the first section of the poem and the first line, Ramanujan calls Madurai as the city of temples and poets. And this same recognition has been given by old poets through their compositions. He also refers to the tradition of old poets who sang about the grandeur of the river, of the Vaigai River. Now, the tradition of old poets out here, he implies the Sangam poetic tradition, which talked about love and longing and the inherent connection between nature and humans. Now, the new poets also quoted the old poets. And he, in the first section, he clearly mentions that the Vaigai River dries up every summer, bearing the sand ribs. Bearing the sand ribs is a metaphor that he uses, and this metaphor he implements to connote to the idea that the river is a living creature and those associated with it or those around it is also living. He reveals the pitiful state of this river due to human proliferation in the first stanza of this poem. It remains neglected as women's hair clog the water gates and marks of futile attempts of repairing of the rusty bars could be seen. Now, due to modern civilization and too much of interference into nature by human activities, human actions, and the futile attempt of restoring, managing the rivers without proper drainage system, and also dumping of the urban wastes has made our ecology or has turned our ecology into a serious state of crisis. Now, when Ramanujan says that marks of futile attempts could be seen, so this symbolizes how modern times or how modern civilization and human proliferation has impacted our nature. He implements a simile as a poetic device to state that the river is alive by comparing the wet stones of the river with sleepy crocodiles and uses a metaphor to describe the dry stones with shaven water buffaloes lounging in the sun. Now, I hope you know the difference between a simile and a metaphor. A simile is, is an indirect comparison. The use of like is implemented in simile, And in metaphor, there is a direct comparison. Shaven water buffaloes. Let me take you to the poem once. Glistening like sleepy crocodiles. So there is an usage of like. It is a simile. Shaven water buffaloes, metaphor. Now, this technique, these poetic devices, again reminds us of the idea that the river gives life to those who depend on it. He metaphorically transforms the stones of the riverbed into animals, which connotes to the idea that the river behaves like a living, breathing creature which sleeps in the summer, and those associated with it remain calm in the summer season. Now, the poet will shift his attention to the floods. He will give a paradoxical view of the river. The poet refers to an anonymous man who visited Madurai during the floods, and that man could be him. We don't know, the poet doesn't mention it, but it could be his voice too. He goes on to explain the other side of the river during the monsoon, which is in sharp contrast to its temper in the summers. He tells his audiences the dangerous and wild nature of the river as people everywhere talk about its menacing reach at that time of the year. When monsoon comes, due to too much of rainfall, the river floods. And when the river floods, the people talk about how the river is increasing, how the water level is increasing and covering the cobbled steps. They are only focused on estimating or analyzing how the river would be accessible for bathing. I will take you to that portion of the poem. People everywhere talked of the inches rising, of the precise number of cobbled steps run over by the water rising on the bathing places. So you see, people are ignorant, they are not paying attention to the impending damage that would be caused during the floods. Ramanujan mentions the habitual pattern of behavior of Vaigai River during floods. It usually carries off houses, animals, and drowns people. He refers to the common names for cows, Brinda and Gopi, to reveal people's emotional detachment from the drowned animals. He goes on to reveal such detachment in the next stanza by repeating the habitual destruction caused by the river, juxtaposing the habitual loss of lives. Ramanujan is surprised and taken aback to notice that people are only concentrated or people pay attention to the river only during the floods. They don't talk about the loss of lives. They are busy in their own world. They are consumed in their own world. And until and unless a tragedy befalls on you, on personally on someone, the losses is not realized. He refers to the common names of the cows, Brinda and Gopi. This shows that how detached people are, and it is only their it is only a part in their conversation, the loss of lives. The cows that die or the losses that occur, they only are a part in their conversation during the floods, but they never, but they actually are emotionally displaced. They are emotionally distant from people. Ramanujan finds it strange that new poets are not giving any space to the lost lives due to floods. Instead, they continue to quote the old poets who spoke about the river's grandeur only. His repetitive mention of the pregnant woman with twins and the drowned cows poignantly points towards his sensitivity and distress over the lost lives. Such reiteration also suggests that unlike the new poets who only follow the traditional poets, he has given a space to the dead woman with twins and also the animals in the poem, aimed at making the society aware of ecological crisis if human actions exploiting the environment continues. Now, students, I will take you to that section of the poem which refers or which connotes to the ignorant attitude of society. He said the river has water enough to be poetic about only once a year. It carries away in the first half a three village houses, a couple of cows named Gopi and Brinda, and one pregnant woman expecting identical twins with no moles on their bodies with different colored diapers to tell them apart. This is his repetition of a situation that is possible, that is probable. Now, the new poets still quoted the old poets, but no one spoke in verse. Ramanujan out here says that, people, new poets, or, society, they quote the old poets who sang of the river's beauty. And there are certain myths surrounding the Vaigai River also. But no one talks about the lost lives. No one talks about the drowned pregnant woman who could have been carrying twins. Ramanujan brings in that anonymous man through a dialogue which shows his approach to rephrase his same observation by giving voice to that man. He conveys that poets become poetic only once a year when the river floods. He isolates himself from the rest of those poets as he implies that his poetic sentiments for the river have been shaped by the death of the woman, the two identical twins, and the cows. His description of the twins' physical appearance, who died in their mother's womb, assigns significance to their lives, who were not born but lived a very brief life. So it is a matter of grief for Ramanujan that poets don't give a space, a recognition. The society doesn't remember the lost lives, the damage the river creates because of floods. And why the floods happen? Because of an ecological crisis. Because there is too much of human intervention, interference into nature. There is too much of natural, there is too much of degradation of natural resources. Now, these interconnected themes are all collectively projected by Ramanujan through his poem, A River. Let's come to the themes in the poem. First, ecological concern. The poet's eco-critical consciousness can be observed in the first part of the poem as he elaborates how the river appears during the summer season and people's passivity towards it. His implementation of a paradoxical point of view, comparing the two characteristics of the river, raises ecological awareness. Now, he mentions that how hair of women clog the water gates, and also during the floods, people only talk about how to use the river. So they are only focused on the utility of the river. They are emotionally distant from nature, from the river, and also from lives in general. Second, traditional poets versus modern poets. Ramanujan opines that the old poets spoke about the river's vastness and temples in the city. He, as a modern poet, is different from that group of modern poets who follow the traditional manner of representing the river, as he talks about loss of lives and gives space to dead women whose names are forgotten as they were unimportant. Now, first thing, students, there is it is very important that being a poet, being a writer, one should talk about the social issues. So, being a modern poet, Ramanujan talks about the crisis which society faces, emotional crisis or ecological crisis. He gives space to the social issues in his poems. Now, throughout, so the traditional manner of representing the river should be given up. People should also talk about or raise awareness about the lost lives, the damage the river creates. Irony, third theme. The poet ironically portrays how the river is neglected by the society and how people start paying attention to it when it brings menace. He depicts a resemblance between the river and the died pregnant woman, probably with twins. Both of them remain unnamed throughout the poem, pointing out that nature and women remain neglected by the society. Another important aspect of this poem is that Ramanujan criticizes Hindu culture where cows are more important than women. We get names of the cows, Gopi and Brinda, but we don't get names or get names, name of the river and pregnant and the pregnant woman who had died. So there is a connection. He shows a connection with the pregnant woman and the river. Both of them remain unnamed in the poem. So society is not bothered about nature and women. Society finds it trifling to give importance to nature and women. Fourth, apathy. Insensitive and casual approach of the people towards the river has been represented by the poet. Firstly, when he gives a description of the clogged water gates. Secondly, when people talk about the upcoming dangers from the flooding of the river. And lastly, when the society turns blind eye towards lives lost, especially women who have been continued to be devalued in the society. The poetic devices that are used by the poet: allusion, simile, metaphors, and paradox. Paradox means opposite representation, opposite view, opposite point of view. In this PPT, I am giving you 3 links to find out more about the Vaigai River, what are the myths around it, the way it appears during floods, the damage it causes, and why. So, students, I hope you have enjoyed this session, and that is all. Thank you.